Hi, everybody. My name is Leila Wehbe. I'm a faculty member at CMU in the Machine Learning Department and the Neuroscience Institute. I'm very excited to be here as in the second workshop. I was in the first one, and it was very interesting to see the perspective of everybody here. And I'm so excited about this one. It's like really digging deep into complementary directions. So today, I thought I would also talk about something else other than what I talked about last time, and it's more about like how we can change language models or how can we improve on them in order to make them brain models of how the brain processes language, either in language comprehension or in language production, but just as a kind of a like a sneak peek. I'm not going to talk a lot about production because I don't have haven't analyzed. I kind of have some work in that area, but I haven't really analyzed it to the same extent as I have production comprehension. Okay, so let's start. I'm just gonna start the timing so I can keep track. What do we mean by a model for the brain, or I guess what do I mean by it? And I think we can define this in two ways. And classically, maybe the first definition has been a bit more popular in general across the sciences, not just in neuroscience, so people can think of this as an algorithm that exhibits maybe similar properties or similar behavior than the brain. So I have a few observations about how the brain works, and then I designed something that mimics this. And I mean, technically, a language model is obviously not a brain model under that definition, because it's obviously not designed similarly. But it can be argued also to behave like a have behaviors very similar to the brain, because it's actually trained to generate data that other brains or other humans generate. So in some aspects, it's a little bit of that, but of course it needs a lot more work in order to become a model, a brain model. But I think when we talk about brain activity specifically, or the brain specifically, and not just the mind, there's another definition which is also very attractive, and it's the definition that I prefer to work on. Where the algorithm is still trying to kind of behave like the brain and create the same behaviors or do the same computations, but it also it's not like totally agnostic to information from the brain. It also uses brain activity in order to basically try to capture the processes that the brain is doing and actually track them. So it's trying to mimic not just the output of the brain, or not just like the basic organization principles of the brain, but also the processes that the brain makes. And so I think this is like, while the second definition is very attractive to me, and we do have brain activity recordings that can make it happen, I think it's a bit more difficult, because it just takes multiple components, and it's unclear. I think even causally, it's a little bit unclear how to do it, and I'll talk more about this later in the talk. So I mean, here in this talk, I also propose that in order to start towards and build this kind of brain model, we can start with a language model or a large language model. And I think this is maybe like not and again, I'm saying again, I think this is a basis for eventually what's going to become the brain model. I don't think that as they are right now, they are good brain models, just to make sure. I'm also not thinking about this mechanistically. So even if the large language models is built on transformers and the brain is definitely not, that doesn't mean that a language model cannot become a model for the brain at a different level of abstraction. So why is language modeling a good task? I mean, obviously, next word prediction is just a natural part of how we use language, at least in language comprehension. We just do this kind of next word prediction on the fly, maybe not every time, and not all the time, but we're very able to do it, and we often are surprised by the word that actually happens that is not how we completed the sentence. And just to see this, I really like the scene from Arrested Development. So Michael and his sister Lindsay are just having a conversation, And he's telling her about this girl that he met and he really likes her. So he says, it's like we finish each other's, and then Lindsay says, sandwiches. And Michael is like, sentences, why would I say? And Lindsay says, sandwiches. And Michael says, yes, that time I was going to say sandwiches. So the reason why this is funny is that obviously you wouldn't say sandwiches for that first sentence because the real completion, what we expect is sentences. But then actually, like Lindsay does like a simple completion here, which is, yeah, correct. So anyway, so language model is important for the brain, but it's likely not the only thing that the brain is doing. We have so many other things we're trying to solve when we use language. So probably like language model could be useful, like as a task for starting with the scratch with a base model. That could be a useful task, but it's likely not everything that we need. But regardless of like how important language modeling is, it's still the case that because these I think the language modeling task is so difficult that in order to solve it, a model has to really learn a lot of expressive features from the text. And so that could still be a good basis. All right. So typically the kind of experiments I use in my lab in order to study the brain are naturalistic experiments. So here, what I mean by naturalistic experiments, I'm sorry, naturalistic is missing from the title. So here, what I'm talking about is a case in which people sit in a scanner and process a complex task. Maybe they're reading a book or they're maintaining a conversation with someone, and we're recording their brain activity in time. So we have at the end of the experiment a time series of what they are, what they read, and a time series of their brain activity that corresponds to what they read. And then what we can do in order to deal with this is to build an encoding model. And this encoding model is going to be the way that we test hypotheses about what is going on in the brain. And so again, this is a language comprehension task. I'm going to give an example too. So imagine people are just listening or reading a story from a book. We're acquiring the related brain activity. So again, just comprehension for now. An encoding model relies on estimating a vector representation for what the people have read in the scanner. So if for example, if you're reading a story, different kind of features you can construct from that story are just maybe classical language features related to syntax, some embedding space represents semantics. Even you can imagine like building some higher level features that encode like the discourse level or the narrative level, like what are the characters, who are the characters, what they're doing, how they're moving, are they actually interacting in a dialogue, etc. And so based on which one of those feature spaces you use here, you will be testing a different kind of hypothesis. So imagine use, for example, the syntactic feature space. So you represent information in time in a syntactic feature space. The next step is to build a regression model that goes from this feature representation and predict brain activity. And this is typically built using a linear model because you want a simple mapping space from here, because you don't want to modify the vector representation too much. Otherwise, the representation would be not the representation in this vector, but the kind of both representations together, the vector representation and how you modified it here in this step. All right. So after you do this and after you see like basically how well does this vector predict different brain regions, you can say something about the brain regions that are well predicted significantly from that vector representation. For instance, if a region in the brain happens to be very well predicted by the syntactic feature space, you could say that this region is likely processing syntax or something that's very correlated to syntax. And more recently, it's become very popular to use neural networks in order to extract these feature representations. And this is something we discussed in the first workshop. But the idea here is that, I mean, neural networks already are a natural way to go from a complex stimulus to a vector representation, but also specifically language models that are built on neural networks often process the text word by word, or at least they have an embedding for each word that in the text. And from that embedding, depending on which layer you get it, it's just a very easy way to capture information about the word and also the words around it and the context that word has been read. And so you can just integrate it in this encoding modeling pipeline very easily. And after doing this, researchers from labs around the world, including ours, have found that these embeddings from these language models are very predictive. They're very correlated with brain activity during language comprehension. And people have used this framework to answer many, many questions, such as like which regions are predicted, what type of information are presenting, how far back in the future are they capturing information. People have also been a bit I don't think there's a consensus on what that ability to predict means. So in one case, the ability to the reason one group of one hypothesis that's been presented is that one reason why the language models embeddings and the brain activity are so correlated is that the brain itself is, or the language model, the language system in the brain, is actually engaged in predicting the next word. It's a core task, and it kind of shapes the language network. And another explanation is that it's not necessary that the brain itself is doing language modeling on a continuous basis. It's just that the language modeling task itself requires very expressive representations. So in order to solve the language model task, as we just said, you really need a very good representation that captures a lot of different types of information about language. And this is what is predicting the brain activity well. So in any case, under both of these explanations, you can still use the language modeling task as a good backbone. So how do we make this language model into a brain model? And this is again talking about definition 2, where we're trying to track the brain processes, not just produce similar behaviors. The encoding model approach I told you about is a two-step behavior. So a two-step procedure, sorry. You take a language model and then you build an encoding model on top of that. So it's separate. But you can also do basically an end-to-end approach. So instead of taking an independent language model, you either train language model from scratch to go from the stimulus and predict brain activity. This is if you have enough data. Or you maybe take an existing language model and you fine-tune it on the brain data you have, so changing its representation so it's a good prediction of the brain activity. The idea here is that if you had enough data to significantly change that network or to build a network from scratch, this network here is going to approximate some of the brain processes, because in order to best predict the brain activity, you are going to have to identify what is important for the brain and how does it combine words. So it's I'm not saying that you're going to be able to capture everything that the brain is doing, but I think you're going to be hopefully able to capture the important processes that the brain is doing, and because those are going to be the ones that kind of dictate how the brain activity relates to the stimulus. And so if the language model learns correctly to predict brain activity, you can think of it as an in silico brain. So you can go and investigate the model and do some sort of maybe like ablation experiments and other types of interpretation experiments, which might be able to tell you like, oh, this seems to be what the brain is doing, because this is how this model, which perfectly predicts the brain or almost perfectly predicts the brain, this is how it behaves. And of course, I mean, perfect prediction of the brain or even near perfect prediction is still far not in our reach at the moment. Another thing about this language model that's trained to predict brain data is that it might itself become a better language model because it has actually taken these principles from the brain. It has learned what the brain is doing. And maybe there's something in the brain activity. Maybe the brain kind of focuses on specific parts of language, which you can only learn from looking at the brain and which are not necessarily there in text that is online or text that's outputted by people, because, you know, we might not, like things that are very important for the brain might be more low level or might be more like obvious maybe, and you don't even need to say them in a sentence. And a very simple example, for example, you don't see maybe the word yellow next to banana in corpus a lot, but in the brain, you see it a lot. And so just as an analogy, there might be other types of information which are which are there in the brain, which the brain uses to be efficient, to be robust, to learn from few examples, that it doesn't later put into text, because when we use text, we're using it to communicate with other humans, or maybe to just leave notes for ourselves. And we know that the other person knows these things about the world and doesn't need them to be present there. But the language models we train on just text, they do not have such an embedded view of the world, and so they do not have these important principles, or they don't have access to them. Okay, so that's my case for taking a language model and transforming it into a brain model by predicting the brain activity. And so a few years ago, we tried to do this with a model that was already trained on a large online corpus. So this was BERT, and back then BERT was still state of the art. Obviously, it's not true anymore. And what we did is we took the BERT architecture. In this case, we took a 12-layer BERT, and we added additional nodes or additional output heads in order to predict the brain activity recording of participants that were reading the same text as the BERT was being fed. In this case, that particular paradigm we used had words being read at the same duration for each word, 0.5 seconds for each word. And basically, we use a head in order to predict the brain activity as recorded from fMRI. So fMRI is a slow in time. It's a slow recording tool in time, but it gives you a very nice spatial resolution. And we also have MEG recording, or magnetoencephalography recordings. These record the change in the magnetic field around the head that's due to the changes in currents in the head. So those are very small currents, and the magnetic field changes are very small too. And so you can expect the data is very noisy. But, you know, like under the same, if you do the right things, you can still extract useful information from that data. And so that data will be the inverse of fMRI. So it's high in temporal resolution, but doesn't have very good spatial resolution. And so in separate experiments, we also use basically output heads in order to predict the related MEG recordings of different participants as they read the same text. Now, because MEG is fast in time, we're going to use basically, we're going to use the output from the individual words in order to predict the MEG recording for that word. And for fMRI, we use the separator tokens, and we use the output nodes for those in order to predict the fMRI. So for fMRI, we're always looking at a sequence of words that preceded that point in order to predict activity. So we're looking at more than one word because it's a very slow response. So we're going to fine-tune BERT in multiple ways. First, we compare just the non-fine-tuned BERT performance. So we take the base BERT model and we just add a linear layer to predict fMRI activity. So this is just the same as an encoding model. And then we fine-tune BERT to predict one participant's activity. And then we see how well this model does on that same participant's activity, but in a held-out set. We also see if actually training on another person's fMRI activity helps with predicting this particular participant. So we only fine-tune on person Y, and then for person X, we add just a linear model to see if the fine-tuning for person Y helped to predict person X's activity. And finally, we see if we get any sort of transfer between modalities. So we use basically, we transfer first, we fine-tune first to predict MEG, and then we fine-tune to predict this participant's fMRI, and we see if we gain anything from fine-tuning on MEG and on fMRI. So these are our results. This is not a very usual plot, so I'll explain what we're looking at here. So when we use fMRI, we record activity from across the brain, and we have three-dimensional pixels, which we call voxels. So we have about 30,000 of them in any subject. And so here for each participant, and each participant here has a different color, and each line represents basically the mean of the results of those participants across multiple iterations of the model. And so we just kind of retrain the model many times. So that's why you get not just one line, but like an entire confidence interval. And so here we're ranking the accuracy. So the test we use here is actually just a classification test. So chance here is 50%, but here we're looking at the difference between two models. The first model is a vanilla model, and the second one is the one that's fine-tuned for this participant. So basically what we're looking at here is improvement after fine-tuning for each participant and across all of the voxels, and the voxels are ranked from the best performing one to the least performing one. So that's why you get a very large performance in the improvement in performance in the beginning. And then for the bad voxels, it doesn't really matter because we're not really predicting these voxels reliably anyway. And so for all of the participants, we see that fine-tuning the model on that particular participant's fMRI data leads to it being a better model for that participant, which is great. I mean, it's a good I would say sanity check, because that's what you would expect, but it's great that it actually works. Especially given that we do not have a lot of data for this experiment. So in this case, we had only an hour of data, which translates to just a couple thousand time points here, or even less than that. Now we're going to compare the subject transfer model to the vanilla model. And so here, the model is not fine-tuned to that particular participant, but it's fine-tuned for the other participants. As you can see here, except for one participant, which is shown here in yellow, it is actually, we're able to transfer between participants, meaning that the model has learned something that's important across participants and still in fMRI. So it might be something due to basically the dynamics of fMRI activity, not necessarily to what the brain is doing, but it's still something that generalizes across people. And the last experiment here, I'm going to show you basically what happens when we do the MEG transfer. And so for the MEG transfer, it looks like more or less, like if you just look globally, there's not a lot of improvement reliably across everybody. But for some participants, we do see improvements. And when we look at the brain and we see which regions do improve, so these are the regions in red, and on the first line. And it's on the second row, I'm showing you the language regions for these participants. So for the participants for which there is an improvement, but not in all voxels, the improvement actually happens in the language regions. And so here we think that like there has been some transfer of information that's not related to the imaging modality per se, but that's related to something about the brain because it generalizes between MEG and fMRI. And we want to say, like, the second goal that I mentioned was like, would that become, would the model that's trained on the brain become a better language model? And so we tested on a battery of NLP tasks, and it kind of does, kind of similarly, it appears to be on par or marginally better than the vanilla model on some tasks. So we're not able to, I mean, I don't think we had enough data in this case in order to really like take the model above and beyond what just a language model would do. And so what we're doing now is, this is in collaboration with Alex Huth at UD Austin, we're actually collecting a very large data set of brain activity. This is going to be like a kind of a big corpus of fMRI and MEG activity. So this is more like, obviously not like the corpora that language models are trained on now. It's more like maybe the Pentry bank. It's going to be about 1 million words of unique stimuli. This is going to be something we share with the community. And using this data, we're starting to train some of these end-to-end models and trying to see, like, do they become better language models, or do they just help us better understand what the brain is doing? Right. So I just want to talk a little bit about language production, because this was about language comprehension. And I think the problem when we have language production is that we can no longer ignore this additional component here, which is the brain. So before we just had like kind of an arrow from stimulus to the brain, because we could kind of not really insist on the brain, and it wouldn't break the causality, which is that the stimulus is causing brain activity. When we have language production, it is the brain itself that's leading to brain activity, but also leading to the stimulus. So you could still use basically I think, and some people have started doing that, like especially from the labs of Yuri Hassan. So they've started using basically the properties of the stimulus to build encoding models and see where is information represented, even in the case where you are actually producing data. But I think if you really want to model something like conversation or like language production beyond like where are things represented, it's really a more challenging problem than comprehension. I think it's easier maybe to just focus on definition one, where you're trying to build a model that is like the brain in terms of properties and behaviors, because then you just need to basically kind of capture this area over here. But I think if you also still want to be linked to the brain activity, you're going to need to build a model which is both like trying to do what the brain is doing and also trying to predict the brain activity and like be linked to the brain. So I think that just introduces many challenges. So I do think, I mean, we do have a long way ahead in this. I'm going to show you maybe a simple task, which is not specifically about language production, but it's a more interactive task, which might have some ideas of how to proceed when we're going to like start like solving these much bigger, more complex problems. Sorry. Okay. In this task, we're going to talk about how, in this experiment, we're going to talk about how basically solving a specific task with the same stimulus changes how we represent that stimulus. So here, in this case, we're going to look at an experiment in which people were sitting in the scanner and seeing word picture pairs, and then answering different questions about those word picture pairs. And so you can think of the different questions as different tasks. And people have already reported that doing something like this in the scanner changes the representation of the underlying stimulus. One way this is interpreted is that the task emphasizes, creates some attention that emphasizes something that's relevant for the task. People have argued for different mechanisms for this process. Well, what we did here, though, is we wanted to model not just stimulus, but we wanted to kind of create a model that's more complex that captures both the task and the stimulus. So this data set that we were using was from previous experiments in which people looked at 60 different nouns and had 20 different questions. So in this earlier experiment, what we did was to just average all the repetitions of the words because they occurred in 20 different tasks. But for this particular experiment, we don't want to do this averaging. We want to actually take, different combinations of tasks and nouns. And so we're going to have to deal with single trial MEG data, which is noisy, but I mean, you can still do a lot with that. Because, yeah. And so what we start with here is to take every stimulus and every task and build representation for those. So you can do that using BERT. Again, at the time, that was the state of the art. And with that, you could generate different embeddings for those two entities. But we also had, for this data, as from the 2012 paper, we had a data set from Mechanical Turk in which we had many participants answer 218 questions about 120 nouns, 60 of which are the nouns in this experiment. And so when we use the Mechanical Turk embeddings or the BERT embeddings for the word itself, we actually found that we get the same performance. But when we use the Mechanical Turk embedding for the task, we saw that we do much better than the BERT embeddings for the task. And this might just be, I mean, maybe I think probably detecting the task is kind of much more precise in this model because the task occurs much earlier, and then you're looking at different words while thinking of the task. So it might be that this very much targeted data set could be a better representation. So we're going to go forward with this Mechanical Turk representation, even though it's not, a large language model, but it could give us ideas about how to do the same thing with large language models. So for the Mechanical Turk data, we use, in order to build a representation for the tasks, so we have we have many questions that were asked to the participants, 218. And so to build the representation for the tasks, which are 20 of those, so our 20 tasks are actually 20 of those representations, we're just going to look at the words that were not seen in the scanner. So the 60 words and the 20 tasks, and we're going to use this matrix to build a representation for the task. And similarly, for the nouns that were seen in the scanner, we're going to look at the 198 questions that were not the task. And so we're going to build a representation for the nouns from this matrix over here. If you look at the similarity for the tasks, just the similarity structures of the embedding we built, we see that they kind of cluster in 3 different clusters. One related to kind of manipulability, one is more like object features like size and shape, and one is more about animacy. Just to give you an idea of what kind of task embeddings we get. And just quickly, I'm running a bit out of time. So here, we're looking at multiple different hypotheses. In the first one, we just think that there's no task effect, so it's just the stimulus affecting the brain activity. The other one is that there is no stimulus effect, where the task is affecting brain activity. So these are more like baseline stimuli. Our third hypothesis is that there is an effect from both, but they don't interact with each other, so their effect is additive. And the third one is that there is some interaction between the task and stimulus semantics, and then that's what's being represented in the brain activity. So we compute this interaction in different ways. We have one case in which we actually learn it from the embeddings. But I'm just going to tell you about the simpler case where we compute the attention from the embeddings themselves. And so basically, we capture a similarity between each task and the stimulus dimensions. So here, remember, for each word, we had 198 dimensions and the 20 tasks. So for each dimension, we just capture, and for each one task, we kind of weigh that dimension based on how similar that particular dimension is to the task. For instance, for is it made of metal, we have 5 different dimensions which are similar to this is it made of metal, so such as silver was invented, etc. And these are the ones that are going to be more upweighted for that word, for that specific task. And so here are the results that we get. So this is MEG, so we have high temporal resolution, and the word appears at time 0 over here. And we look at our ability to predict brain activity. So using the stimulus, which is hypothesis 1, we predict brain activity more or less starting from kind of the beginning, around 100 milliseconds, and then it peaks around 200 milliseconds and stays up for around 600 till around 600 milliseconds. And for the task, we don't really predict so well, except around 500 milliseconds. And so remember that number. When we look at all of the other more complex hypotheses, including the additive one, we see that the region where we actually predict better than just the stimulus is around 500 milliseconds. And this also corresponds to when the task on its own is predictive. So likely around this time is when basically the task is being, like the subject starts by understanding the word, and then they answer the task. And so we see, unfortunately, we don't have enough data in this particular case, because this was a smaller experiment, we don't have enough data to kind of differentiate between these different hypotheses, which is whether the task and stimulus representations are independent or whether they interact. But in future work, we're very interested in kind of moving to more complex data sets that have that. And so here we can also look at we could also look at which regions in the brain are more predictive of the task or the word. And so in order to look at this, we look at classification cases in which the 2 cases have the same word, and so only the task is different. And so this really happens, the task happens between 450 to 550 milliseconds. And then in this on the right, we look at classification cases in which the 2 tasks are the same, but the word differs. And that you see that the word representation mostly happens until around 500 milliseconds to 550. And so this is after the word is being processed is when the task starts happening. And so in conclusion, we see that we were able to build these computational models that predict brain recordings as a function of both the task and the stimulus. This was using basically single zero-shot setting. So we never had in the data set kind of both the task and the stimulus in the same time. And we actually do this where we remove both the task and the stimulus overall in the entire data set. So both the combination and the unique presence is not there. We see that models that integrates both the task and the stimulus do better, especially around 400 to like 475 to 650 milliseconds. And this corresponds to after the stimulus is processing. And again, we didn't have enough data in this case to like consider really interactive functions of the task and the stimulus, but we're looking to do that in future work. And so going back to this case in which we build a network that kind of takes into account both what the brain is doing and the brain activity, I think we're going to have to work on kind of ideas that are similar to this, but that take into account more, like, for example, what a person is trying to do, like the question that they're being asked, what they're trying to answer. And so whenever we're going to build these models for more interactive experiments, we're going to have to take into account interaction, and hopefully we'll have enough data to do that. And just in conclusion, I told you that language models are already quite popular in studying language comprehension, and they can be modified to become more predictive, but also hopefully become better brain models. And if they are better brain models, they can be investigated themselves as an in silico brain. And I finished by saying that we need more flexible approaches to capture the different components that underlie real-life language production. That's it. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you so much.